Hello, MavMind Collective, and welcome to another episode of the Hypnosales Show. Today we're going to be understanding the VAK system. So I've mentioned the VAK system, or otherwise known as VAK system, in some of my other videos, previous videos I've made. You probably, if you're in a customer-facing role like I am, you probably have had some sort of training in this, or you understand about the three modalities or the representational systems that we typically all have: visual, audio, and kinesthetic. That's what VAK stands for: visual, audio, and kinesthetic. The idea is that at a subconscious level, we have a preference towards one over the other. Or in some cases, what I have found is we have a preference towards one or two, and we not so much the third one, whatever it is. And each of us are different. All of us are a little different, and we have our combination. Just like our personalities are different, and when we take personality tests, usually we find out we're in one of four quadrants, but we lean towards one. But we usually have a mix. It's very rare that you're going to be absolutely in one quadrant and not in the others. So the same thing here. All of us here, typically, we have all of these modalities, all of these representational systems going on all at the same time. But when it comes down to a personal preference, we typically lean towards one or the other. Now, what dictates what you lean towards is really based on how you're raised and what you've learned and what you've specialized in and what your job is typically, and the people around you, your environment that you grow up in. Typically, that will help foster one preference for one of these or two of these over all three of them. But when we get into a customer-facing role, typically, because we're dealing with so many different types of clients and prospects and customers that have all different varieties of combinations of these preferences, typically we get really good at balancing ourselves out in our job. Skill-wise, our skills become very attuned to the different ones, and we typically can communicate in all three different ways depending on who we're talking with and what we sense their preference is. And sometimes I think we do this subconsciously without really knowing it when we're good at our job. Now, if you're not good at your job, if you're in a customer-facing role and you're not really good at it, then you're probably not going to be balanced. What's going to be happening in that case is you're leaning towards your preference, which is one or maybe two of them, and you're leaving the third one out. So when you talk to someone in a customer-facing engagement type scenario, and that third one, whichever one it is, if it's left out, then you're not going to connect with that person as well. They're going to sense that I don't really know if I get along with you very well. You're going to have an incongruency because you're preferring your modality or your representational system, and you're not matching theirs. So if you're good at it, though, however, you've learned to balance between all three, and that's a good thing. Now, I do want to take a little bit deeper dive into this because I have talked about this before and you've had training in it, but I want to give you a couple more secrets from the hypnotic selling perspective, the hypnosales perspective, that I've learned about VAK in my practice using hypnosales and subconscious selling techniques and hypnotic language. And it all comes down to, at a subconscious level, all of us learn the different words that are visual words, audio words, and kinesthetic words. We learn these words in various ways, and our preferences are typically formed based on which words we like and how we like what they mean and how we like to use those words. Okay, so that typically forms our preference, and that's why some people lean towards one or two versus all three of them. In a general, and if everything is all equal, typically that's what's happening. You're going towards your preference. When you're talking with your clients and prospects and customers, you have to understand that they have their preferences, and you should be listening for the words they use. And you should look at their emails and look for and scan. And this is a good practice. If you've never done this before, look at the emails you get from your prospect, and just as a test, as an exercise, go through and see if you can find and count how many words are visual, audio, and kinesthetic, and then come up with a percentage. And you'll typically find that they'll be leaning heavily towards one or maybe two of them, and they probably won't even have certain words from the third one won't even show up in their email. So that's a good way to figure it out. When I've worked with other colleagues and coworkers, sometimes when they bring me in to help them in the middle of a sales cycle or middle of an implementation cycle, let's say post-sale, I typically will ask to see the emails of that person because I want to do this exercise. I want to see if they have a visual, audio, or kinesthetic lean a preference towards one or two of those, to where then I know when I communicate with that particular person, I know I can reflect back and mirror back the same word, use the same word, so I can create a very congruent communication style and communication pattern with them, so they relate to me and they like me and they enjoy me helping them, and I don't rub them the wrong way. That's what you want it to. You want it to be as congruent as you can. So you want to figure out ahead of time, if you can, by looking at their emails. Now, the other aspect of this is that as we learn these words and we gain these preferences towards one set of words versus another, we will learn certain words first as we're growing up. So you have to understand that the way the subconscious works is it's going to take the word that it learns and it's going to put it into the subconscious. It's going to have a memory of that. It's going to keep that memory. And anytime it identifies that word when someone else is using it, or it realizes the meaning of what you're saying, it'll translate in the subconscious. It'll translate to that initial word that it learned to use. So if the first word you learn as like say an audio preferenced person, you learn the word talk, for example. Talk might be the first one that you learn. Okay, so let's just circle that one there. Let's say that's the first word you learn. Okay, and if this is a timeline through time, and the first word here is talk, number one, that's the first one I ever learn is the word talk. Then every time I hear another word, or I learn about another word that's audio oriented, let's say like discuss, like the word discuss, okay? So let's say I learn the word discuss later as I get older, and that becomes the second one I learn. What the subconscious is doing is when it hears the word discuss, in order to figure out what it means, it actually secretly, subconsciously, without you being aware of it, goes back and finds the first reference of a word that means the same thing, but was much more simpler. And it was the first one, initial one that's in its subconscious. And this is our brain being as efficient as possible. Instead of storing both words and the meaning of both words, it stores the initial one, and then it just stores almost like a pointer or a reference to the first one. Just like we do in programming languages. To save space and to become efficient, we'll have the initial set, and then if another word means the same thing, or another piece of code in a program means the same thing, we'll just refer to the first one and have that execute versus the writing a whole another set of redundant code. So our brain's doing the same thing in order to be efficient. And even when I learn a third one later, it'll come back and it'll refer to that second one, and then that one will refer to the first one, and it always reduces down in our subconscious down to the very first word we heard, the most easiest word to remember, the shortest word, and typically the initial or the shortest one that we have learned to store to be efficient in our brain, in our subconscious. So that's what's happening. So knowing this, what you can do is when you talk with someone, listen to the words they use. And if you want to really get congruent with them in a conversation perspective, you want to really relate to them, make them feel comfortable with you, try to figure out what the most common, easiest, simplest word you can use to let them, so you know that when they're translating it down in their subconscious, you can just get right to that word. Instead of using the word discuss or let's have a conversation, instead of saying, for example, to an audio preferenced person, instead of saying, hey, let's schedule a conversation, I want to have a conversation about this, instead say, hey, I think we need to schedule some time to talk about this. Or instead of saying, hey, can you get on chat? Let's chat about this. You say, hey, I think we should talk about this. So always reduce it back down to the simple, easiest, potentially what the first word that any of us have ever heard when it comes to that particular type of meaning. And it'll cut right through and it'll save them time in their subconscious to have to translate to what that basic word is. You just use that basic word. And this is why it's very common that from a marketing perspective or any kind of a communication, a corporate communication perspective, you always want to reduce the language down to like 7th grade level. If you've ever heard of that, right? Let's reduce it down to 7th grade level or 6th grade level. That's what's really happening. You're reducing it down to basically what's the first thing you might have heard or learned about at an early age. So it can cut right through and you don't leave it up to chance for the recipient, the listener, to translate it themselves and potentially translate it to the wrong meaning, and they have the wrong meaning. So I'm using this as an example. You can do this with same thing with visual and with kinesthetic too. So like for example, here I have look and see. Those are probably the first words we hear. Look, see, do you see that? Look at that. Hey, look over here. Like we use those words. Show typically will be something we'll learn later as a second one. Display, could you display that for me? Could you reveal that for me? Hey, can you picture what's going on here? Like those are more advanced words, but typically it's going to reduce down to like look and see. Typically, and those are the words that you're going to want to use the most. And typically in emails, those are the words you're going to look for the most too, to make sure you identify if they're more of a visual person. And the same thing with kinesthetic people, preferences, people that are considered kinesthetic people typically like the word get. And get is the most basic one. And also make and feel typically are very common basic first words that you hear. And then later on you have the word I get a sense here. I'm not sure I sense, or this doesn't make sense. Right? Make, but then sense. And then demo, could you demo that for me? That's typically a more advanced word later that gets translated into to show or make or to get a sense of it. So when I'm listening to people talk to me, or I visually see how they're writing emails to me, or I watch their body language, which is more of the kinesthetic. Kinesthetic preferences, typically people show the body language a lot more too, because their preference is more in their body than it is in what they see or what they hear. And they'll usually even use words like phrases that kind of mimic like something in the body. Like they'll say, I need to get my arms around this. That's what they'll say. I need to get my brain, get my arm around this. This is not quite, I'm not sure I don't think I caught what you're saying here. I'm not catching this. That's what they'll say, because it's like a phrase of like catching something, catching a ball or something. Just not quite catching, or I'm just not quite getting a grasp on this. I'm not grasping the concept of it, what you're talking about right now. So even though they're talking about an audio, they're describing it as a kinesthetic type of a preference when they use the word grasp. Now, grasp is really the more advanced word. You would want to respond with a word like get, or all right, I'll help you get to the point. We'll get to the point. I'll help you get it, okay? And that's another way you can tell if it's audio, visual, or kinesthetic is they'll say, typically, I get what you're saying, I hear what you're saying, I see what you're saying. Those are the three most common ones. I get what you're saying. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I see what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. Typically, you can hear those three phrases and you can kind of instantly kind of categorize which VAK they have a preference for. The last one I'll say that I've heard is very common is sounds good. That looks good. Sounds good. Yeah, makes sense. Those are the three other ways they'll say it. Looks good, sounds good, makes sense. So by those phrases right there, you can usually tell what their preference is and then adjust your responses back using the most minimal words you can to where you save them the trouble of having to do this hop from these more advanced words to the more primitive, easiest first words they heard, and you just go right to here and just focus in on that very first word and make it really easy for them to feel comfortable with you and to communicate with you and to always create that congruency when it comes to whatever the preference they have, whether it's visual, audio, or kinesthetic. Thank you for watching. I know you find value in these videos, didn't you? So if you, like me, are in a customer-facing role, I'm wondering if you want to watch another video now designed to help you get better at what you do every day. Or not. You don't have to watch another video if you don't want to.